constitutional attorney Paige Pate. All right, Paige, good to see you. So in Randy's piece, she reminds us that it was Donald Trump who said there were 2 phone calls and a meeting, and it was the president who actually asked Comey if he was under investigation. So given that is all out there, did he essentially waive his right to invoke executive privilege?
I think he did, Fred. I mean, that's one of the clearest reasons why I don't think executive privilege is appropriate in a situation like this, and I don't think a court would enforce any attempt by the White House to invoke executive privilege. If you think back to the Obama administration, during the investigation into the Fast and Furious ATF operation, Congress wanted to get access to a lot of documents relating to the discussions about how that operation was put together and how it was going to be portrayed to the media. The Obama administration said, no, we're going to assert a privilege here, an executive deliberative privilege, and not produce these documents. It was challenged in court, and the Obama administration lost for that very same reason, because they had already disclosed some of that information publicly, so there was no need for the privilege.
Okay, also with us, former White House ethics lawyer Richard Painter, also joining in on the conversation. Good to see you, Richard. So if this president says, or this White House says, it is reviewing whether executive privilege is something they want to use, what are the things that they are reviewing?
Well, there are 2 serious problems with using the executive privilege here. First, Director Comey is not a current employee of the government, so they have no ability to persuade him not to testify if he wants to testify. In the vast majority of situations where executive privilege is asserted, it's asserted by a current White House employee who says that executive privilege is being asserted and therefore he refuses to testify. That will not likely be the case with Mr. Comey, who was no longer employed by the president, was fired by the president, and was referred to in derogatory terms by the president in a conversation with the Russian ambassador. Second, the president has already tweeted about Director Comey, has talked about Director Comey with a number of people, including with the Russian ambassador. And it would be patently absurd to say that the president has the right to talk about Comey with the Russian ambassador, and Comey doesn't have the right to tell the United States Congress what the president said to Mr. Comey. It makes absolutely no sense. I think the privilege, if there was any, has been waived. And as I said, since he's not a current government employee, it's going to be impossible, very, very difficult to get him not to testify if that's what he wants to do. I don't think a court is going to enter an order telling Director Comey that he may not tell Congress what the President of the United States said to him.
And then, Paige, might it have been made difficult, the president, in so doing, with this veiled threat? It was that tweet a while ago in which the president said, James Comey better hope that there are no tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. So perhaps, some interpret that as a veiled threat. We also know that, when Comey testifies, there are a number of people in the Senate Intelligence Committee who know him well, who are friends with him. Perhaps he goes in with an advantage. But what would be some of the questions you would ask James Comey, knowing that tweet, knowing the reported circumstances of these meetings?
Well, I'm certain that everyone in Congress and really everyone in America wants to know Jim Comey's version of what happened during those meetings. What actually did the president ask him? Did he make any assurances to the president that he was not under investigation, which I find incredible, knowing Jim Comey's reputation? Did Jim Comey felt pressured by the president during any of these meetings to either drop the investigation or change direction in the investigation? All of that information, I think, is something that that the Congress can get into without having to worry about executive privilege. Now, there could be an exception, and I'm certain that Jim Comey will not testify, say, if they also discuss some matter relating to an ISIS investigation or national security, something outside of their discussion specifically about the Flynn investigation. So it's possible, in fact, I think it's likely that Jim Comey will reserve some of that conversation and keep that private, but I think he's going to be willing and anxious to discuss Mr. Trump's position specifically on the investigation.
And then, Richard, how about these contemporaneous notes? There have been many references made to the note-taking of James Comey. How might that material assist in the line of questioning on Capitol Hill?
Well, obviously, if he made contemporaneous notes, that's strong evidence of what was actually said in these conversations with the president. And
But in
perhaps he
court, it
has
would be
contemporaneous
submitted
notes.
perhaps as, and in court it would be, perhaps submitted as evidence, but during the Senate Intel Committee type of hearing, how might that reference be made?
Well, I think that the Intel Committee is going to want to see the notes, and these notes are going to be evidence, possibly, it appears that they are evidence of obstruction of justice by the president, but we'll see what the notes actually say and how they match up with what Director Comey says and what the president says in response, if he has a different version of the facts. But we just need to know the facts, and we're going to start with Director Comey's version and the notes and his testimony, and then go from there. But it's critically important to find out what happened and whether the President of the United States actually engaged in obstruction of justice by threatening to fire the FBI director if he did not stop the Flynn investigation or other aspects of the Russia investigation.
And then quickly, Paige, how would the version of the president ever be part of the testimony equation on Capitol Hill? He wouldn't be called to testify, would he?
No, I can't imagine that he would. I suppose it's probably something we should expect to see a series of tweets while Comey is testifying. This is not true. That's not what I said. If they can keep his phone away from him, maybe we won't see that. Maybe we'll get another non-answer from Press Secretary Spicer about what the White House's position is. But this is really going to come down to a credibility question. Do you believe Jim Comey or do you believe President Trump? And that's going to be a decision for the American people.
All right, Paige Pate, Richard Painter, good to see both of you gentlemen. Thanks so much.
Thank you.